Hello, and welcome to this session titled The State of Alternative Protein for a Roadmap for Success by Varun Deshpande. I'm Anthony Lau, and I'll be the MC for this session. Following the presentation, we'll move on to a live Q&A session where Varun will respond to your questions. You can submit questions through the Small Card Live discussion feature. Then after 45 minutes, we'll bring the session to an end. Now, I would like to introduce our speaker for this session. Varun Deshpande is the managing director at the Good Food Institute Asia, where he works with scientists, foundation, governments, and businesses to build the alternative protein sector across the continent. He has been named a leading young voice for climate solutions by India Climate Collaborative, one of Asia's most influential tastemakers by Tesla Asia, and one of India's 25 most influential young citizens by GQ. So here's Varun.
Thank you so much, Anthony, and thank you everyone for being here. So as Anthony said, my name is Varun Deshpande, and I'm either Managing Director or President for the Good Food Institute across Asia. We're still figuring out the titles. And I'm going to be speaking today about the alternative protein sector, which is the area in which GFI works, and what we consider a roadmap for success in this area. I also think it's really interesting that we can draw direct parallels between alternative proteins and GFI's work, and how we might think about effective altruism, community building, and sort of building the space, the field of effective altruism, especially in newer markets or newer geographies across Asia. Now, as many of you may already know, the Good Food Institute is the central field building organization within alternative proteins. We work towards a better, a more secure, sustainable, and just food supply by transforming the global supply of meat, eggs, and dairy. And we do this across a few main areas of work: science, business, and policy. We're actually a global network of organizations. So we have organizations in India, Singapore, Israel, Europe, mainly out of London and Brussels, but growing across Europe, in Brazil, and in the United States. And we're currently setting up organizations in Japan and Korea, which is what I've been tasked with doing. Now, I myself started the India organization and ran it for over 4 years, and I'm now stepping into this Asia-wide role. So the principal question that we care about at the Good Food Institute, which is a concern that's shared by many of you that are watching this and many of the people in the broader effective altruism community, is how are we going to feed nearly 10 billion people by the year 2050, over 50% of which will still be in Asia, through systems which do not continue to break the planet and inflict tremendous harm, right? And as we know, a significant piece of this equation is our current global protein supply, particularly the supply of meat, eggs, and dairy from industrialized animal agriculture and fishing. So I'm not going to go into all of these statistics because I think if you're familiar with some of our work, you might already know. But when we look at across the dimensions of sustainability, efficiency, and safety, there's huge challenges that are presented by the industrial supply of animal agriculture. By the way, I apologize for the sounds of Mumbai in the background. I'm speaking to you from Mumbai, so you'll hear a few cars on the road. But when we think about sustainability, efficiency, and safety, as I said, very many people who've been studying the industrialized supply of meat, eggs, and dairy have identified it's one of the top 2 or 3 most important causes or central causes of the world's most pressing problems, let's say under the umbrella of climate change. So all the things that we all care about: deforestation, ocean dead zones, ocean acidification, species loss, biodiversity loss, greenhouse gas emissions, global warming, etc. We simply will not adhere to the Paris Climate Agreement or the Sustainable Development Goals, any of our promises to the planetary health, without reshaping global protein supply. As an example, it causes more climate change than all the emissions of the entire transportation sector combined. The reason for this is very simple. Animals are inherently poor or inefficient protein production platforms. So a chicken, which is the most efficient farmed animal, takes in 8 or 9 calories of feed in the form of corn, soy, wheat, etc., to give us 1 calorie out in the form of meat, right? So we're using huge swaths of land, water, emitting huge amounts of greenhouse gases, effluents, etc., to get meager returns. And as we all know, additionally, from a safety standpoint, there are these huge challenges because we're feeding over 70% of global antimicrobials to farm animals as opposed to humans. And we also have these issues of zoonotic disease because these animals are crowded together. And so we see outbreaks of things like avian flu, African swine fever, etc. And then we also see the huge threat of antimicrobial resistance, which has been identified as perhaps an even bigger issue than climate change. And of course, as we know within the effective altruism community, animal welfare is also something about which we should be very concerned. I mean, industrialized animal farming is called factory farming for a reason. It is, in my belief, maybe the biggest moral travesty that exists on this earth today, because we're subjecting dozens of billions of animals and trillions of fish to mutilation and pain and a lifetime of essentially dominion, where perhaps we no longer need to do that. I just also wanted to highlight one specific aspect of this, which is the issues that we're talking about particularly impact the global south. So the statistics here are global, but also from India. So if you look at the number on the right there, the government of India has already identified that 600 million Indians are already living under extreme water stress. So when we think about transitioning to a better food supply, we have to make sure, especially in places that are vulnerable, like India, that we have something that is far more sustainable and equitable in place for the future. There is also this additional issue, as I mentioned, of food safety, rather. If you look at the bottom right of the screen there, low and middle income countries like India, regions like Southeast Asia, etc., they make up about 41% of the world's population, but they suffer about 75% of the world's foodborne illness-related deaths, right? So all of these issues are things that deeply impact our population's ability to shape their own destiny. Of course, everything I'm saying has been known for some time, right? So all of the things I'm talking about have been identified by the World Health Organization or the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the Eat Lancet Foundation, a number of different, the UN Environmental Program, number of different institutes that study these things day in, day out. But it isn't really changing the equation. Global meat demand is actually rising to the extent that we might need to produce about anywhere between 62% to 242% more meat by the year 2050. And a significant portion of that growth is driven by rising income in places like South Asia, Southeast Asia, of course, China, etc. So our theory of change is very simple. As you might know, GFI in the alternative protein sector focuses on not convincing people to switch from chicken to chickpeas or from beef to broccoli or from mutton to mung beans. The idea here is very simple. Let's give people what they want, but made in a different way so that it doesn't continue to break the planet. So the goal here is to provide the meat, eggs, and dairy that people love, but made from different sources using science and technology so that it feels like a simple switch and not a sacrifice. People are still getting all the sensory and the cultural resonance and the economic benefits of an industry of meat, but without the large-scale slaughter and hunting and fishing of animals. Now, as you might know, there are three main categories of alternative proteins, and I'm not going to go very deeply into these because I'd love to talk more about the ecosystem or the field building aspects of this. But this is the kind of work that we do day in, day out, is think about how we might improve these categories of alternative proteins. There are plant-based proteins, which, as you might know, if you've tried the Impossible Burger or any of these products, are made from plant or crop ingredients. But once again, they're meant to go far beyond the previous generation of mock meats or soy nuggets to give us the perfect sensory and cultural resonance of eating meat. So the idea here is it should feel like you're cooking a beef burger if you're eating one of these Beyond Burgers or Impossible Burgers or any of the others that are on the market, right? In terms of the sizzle, the smell, the feel of being at a backyard barbecue or at a baseball game, etc. Similarly, there's fermentation-enabled proteins, which fermentation, if you've eaten kimchi or yogurt or had beer, you know that fermentation has been around for millennia. But this is a very specific application of fermentation in the alternative protein sector, using microorganisms to produce ingredients that go into alternative protein products. And then finally, there's cultivated meat, which does feel a little bit like science fiction because it's taking cell culture. You take cells from animals and then produce them at very large scale, and then you produce meat from those cells. So that's biologically identical to animal meat, but without needing to slaughter the animal. So it's like you're cutting out the middle animal. And this one is a little bit further in the future. However, it's already available in Singapore. And I'm going to speak a little bit about that as well. One thing to note here is that, while I'm going to jump into some of the field building aspects soon, you will see on the market hybrids of these products, and maybe a few years from now, we won't necessarily think about them as plant-based versus fermentation-derived versus cultivated. We'll just think about them as new sources of meat because they'll be hybrid products. So we're starting to see, for instance, companies producing cultivated fat that is made from animal cells, so authentic animal fat that can then be mixed in with otherwise fully plant-based formulations to give you a much better tasting, much more meaty tasting product, right? And so these things are still coming to market, but the idea here is that you can get exactly the taste that you need without the slaughter. Now, taking a step back, we've seen over the last few years, maybe 10 years, alternative protein grow very rapidly. And I think there's a lot of parallels between what's been happening in our space of alternative proteins and the broader effective altruism movement. As many of you know, effective altruism started in a number of different rooms, but perhaps the most pivotal moment was people coming together, 23 people coming together and saying they wanted to give away a certain proportion of their income, right? And many things have changed since then. In 2022, now we're talking about GiveWell directing $1 billion a year towards the causes that, or the charities that they've identified. We're also looking at, of course, the long-termism area growing very rapidly and the talent pool growing very rapidly. So there's a lot of exciting things that have happened in the interim in the effective altruism movement. And that is very similar to what's happening in alternative proteins, right? So this is kind of the landscape globally. This is the landscape in the US. So if you look at the number of companies now, it's grown very vastly from what it was earlier. So some of these, it's going to be impossible even for me to know many of the companies that are on the market now, even though we track them very closely. I think very importantly as well, we've seen huge meat companies, huge food companies, the likes of Smithfield, which is the largest pork producer in the world, Cargill, Tyson Foods, all of these folks enter the space. Already by the end of 2019, 9 out of the top 10 US meat producers had either started their own plant-based meat company or invested in another. And of course, we'll see a lot of market cycles, we'll see ups and downs, we'll see companies go out of business, but this is really encouraging in terms of we're now starting to see a lot of the conversations that we were having and the science that we were looking to stimulate turn into actual products that can substitute animal meat products on the market. And there are very many people that have studied the potential of this space. So if you look at this slide, I know there's very many numbers on the screen here, but the takeaway here is that many folks like A.T. Kearney, Credit Suisse, Barclays, UBS, etc., the folks that study these things day in, day out, have sized the market for alternative proteins, including all categories, at something as large as $1 trillion by 2050. Now, all of this market growth is great, but perhaps what is even more encouraging is that we've seen a lot of advancement in terms of the essential aspects of building the field. So I'll give a couple further examples of what's been happening. And of course, I've been working in India for the last 4 years. So we've seen really from the ground up, we've seen the launch of a new industry in India as well. So these are some names of the folks that we work with, and I'm not going to go deeply into it, but we've got about 80 plus folks who are working across the value chain. If you look at ingredients, equipment, co-manufacturers, research institutions, distribution, you'll see a lot of really exciting things that are happening in the market. And it's been really satisfying to watch this because it's like an industry is growing from scratch right before our very eyes. We've also seen, and perhaps this is one of the more fun things that our team gets to do, we've seen the likes of cricket stars and Bollywood actors come in and really support the space. On the right there, you'll see we work with a company called Swiggy, which gets groceries to millions of people every day. We help them carve out a specific plant-based meat button on their meat page. And so there's been really exciting things that have happened across the board. And globally, as I mentioned earlier, while some things look like science fiction initially, we've seen things like cultivated meat, that is, once again, meat made from animal cells, take off in a big way. So we've seen now pilot scale facilities are now being inaugurated for cultivated meat. We've seen Singapore enable the sale of cultivated meat. So you can go to Singapore today and order meat that's made from cells, chicken breast that's made without slaughtering a chicken, which is really exciting. And these are things that are really perhaps weren't even possible to predict a few years ago. The great news is that all of these advancements are actively supporting our goals in terms of planetary health. So some of the work that we've done, for instance, to look at the the resource burdens of plant-based meat and cultivated meat and fermentation-derived proteins relative to their conventional animal counterparts showcases order of magnitude improvements in terms of land use, water use, all of the things that we all care about. So the good news is, if we are indeed going to substitute animal protein with these products, we're having the impact that we would like to have in terms of essentially saving the planet. But coming back to what I was saying earlier, I think all of this market development is exciting, but what needs to happen, we realize, is fundamental improvements in the field. And that involves several inputs that perhaps the market would not solve on its own, because companies are not incentivized to do this, right? So the kind of work that GFI does as a field building organization is to quite literally build the field. So we're looking at, yes, getting more companies started, funneling more talent into the market side of things, but also looking at scientific research, making sure that capital continues to flow, and in fact, the right type of capital continues to flow. More and more talent flows into the scientific landscape and the policy landscape. Policy support happens, supply chain development happens. So it's a very complex sort of ecosystem building play, which will make sure that we actually get to the place that we need to be. So I've noted down some of the aspects here that need to advance for us to actually have a thriving alternative protein sector on the scale that we need it. And they include what's on the screen here. So public, private, and philanthropic investment, research and technological commercialization, talent development and incubation, agricultural integration and value addition, and then, of course, scaling of the startups and the manufacturers and the suppliers. And the ultimate goal, of course, is better taste, lower costs, improved nutrition and quality, and greater access, which once again harks back to that theory of change. Tastes the same or better, and costs the same or less, so that people can actually substitute their animal consumption, right? And you'll also notice that very many of these things are directly applicable or analogous to what needs to happen in a space like the effective altruism community or any one of its cause areas. So if we're thinking through, for instance, how we might build an ecosystem around AI safety, whether in one country or globally, many of these things are directly applicable or analogous to what we want to happen. So that brings me to kind of the definition of a field building organization. This has been something that we've been thinking about at GFI for some time, because initially maybe the things that we were trying to accomplish and focusing all of our energies towards 5 years ago as an organization or a network of organizations was slightly different to where we are now. At this point, we've been able to kind of zoom out and think more expansively, think about what I mentioned on the previous slide, which is what actually needs to exist in terms of the building blocks of an ecosystem so that we can truly advance on all of these dimensions. So, the important insight here is that field building organizations are meant to essentially make themselves obsolete eventually, right? So we at GFI would love to make ourselves obsolete as fast as possible. We'd love to build a world where alternative proteins are no longer alternative, but rather a viable default option, so that we can actually actively confine industrial animal agriculture to the dustbin of history, given its myriad harms, right? And I think that's something that is very relevant and very similar to what many meta organizations in EA are doing as well. Build a field so that that field can take care of itself, that rainforest can nurture itself and continue to grow. And I'd like to offer a couple of examples of how we do this and maybe what the parallels might be to EA. And I'll start with talent development. One particular project, and this might be the thing that I personally am most excited about in our entire kind of universe of initiatives. We do something called the Alt Protein Project, which is essentially student groups at universities, right? And now it's also evolved to citywide groups, etc. But the idea here is ultimately the lifeblood of this industry has to be the talent that flows into it. And that's obviously very similar to how effective altruism field building organizations think about talent as well. So we've started a number of groups. At this point, it's about 36 groups that are across the world that look into things like launching university level courses, essentially educating their faculty and their professors of how they should be doing research in the space, even doing things like approaching local governments on creating incentives to create the field of alternative proteins or advance the field of alternative proteins locally. Now, the slide here shows the first 16 of these alt protein projects. It's already out of date because we just announced 20 more. But yeah, so there are very many of these now. There's one in the current cohort, the newer one that I just mentioned. There's one in New Delhi. There's two in Singapore. So the epicenter of all of this is shifting eastwards to Asia as well, which is really exciting. The second thing that I'd like to highlight is we also think about capital deployment in a very deliberate way. And I put this slide up on the screen to kind of show you all of the things that I'm saying sound like a lot of progress has been made, which is exciting, but we're very far behind where we need to be. So if you look at alternative proteins on the bottom there, roughly $11 billion has been invested in this space across 11 years. But just above it, you'll see in renewable energy, we've seen nearly $2 trillion in about half the time, that's fantastic, of course. The energy transition is incredibly important to the future of our planet and our species and all the other species on this planet. But naturally, what we're saying is that given that alternative proteins have, or the protein transition has perhaps the same importance to us as the energy transition, we're really looking at a drop in the ocean relative to what actually should happen within the capital deployment space. Another way of kind of visualizing this is if you look at the $11 billion that's been invested globally, very little of it has come in some of the newer markets across Asia, right? So it's obviously a huge proportion of that has gone into the US. Israel has definitely punched way above its weight as it does in many technology sectors. But if you look at India, which is obviously where I was working, a tiny, tiny fraction of that has been deployed in India. And once again, all of this is still in aggregate, a tiny, tiny fraction of where renewable energy is today. Now, when we think about what capital should flow into as well, it's not just the sexy venture capital style funding of startups, right? We also need to think about funding things in the supply chain that actually form the infrastructure underpinning this sector. So if we're benchmarking against the renewable energy sector, what we would be doing is thinking about what fundamental infrastructure needs to exist, and therefore how do we fund that and get it moving. So, we've done some sizing around, for instance, if we needed to penetrate 6% of global meat consumption by 2030, we'd need 25 million metric tons of texturized plant proteins, right? Stay with me here. The idea here is, as of now, this doesn't work very well with the sexy venture capital model of funding startups, because those startups are mostly focused on consumers. They're not necessarily well suited to invest in this infrastructure, etc. So what we need to do as an organization is look at socially aligned capital that goes into this infrastructure. We also need to do things like fund centers of excellence or scientific research in addition to that infrastructure. So there's very many things that we need to think about as a field building organization that are different from, for instance, what a venture capital organization thinks about, or even what a startup in the space thinks about. So another example, additional to the infrastructure example I just gave, is some of the work we've been doing, for instance, in India to investigate our crop biodiversity for inclusion in this space. So if you look at, for instance, pulses and millets and how they might flow into this space, it's really interesting and exciting as a scientific question, but it's not nearly enough resources are flowing into it. So those are the kinds of things that we do. An additional dimension that we need to think about in terms of field building is, of course, making sure that policy support exists for this space. So I've put some examples on the screen here that are really exciting. I mentioned Singapore has really advanced the space in terms of enabling, from a regulatory standpoint, some of these really futuristic foods to be sold in the marketplace. And this is part of their broader vision for how they want to support future foods and enable food security and climate resilience locally. Similarly, China has made some bold statements about the space. The USA has started funding it as well. Qatar, Israel is a fantastic example of what can happen when we get great policy support in place. But what we need to get to ultimately is this kind of coordinated plan, right? So across ministries. And many of these countries actually have, as you know, most countries are not like Israel and Singapore. Most countries have a complex bureaucracy, a patchwork of agencies in government. So really what we need to do is focus on very many different government agencies and individual institutions to kind of weave them all together. And this is just an example of the kinds of things that we've done in India. And of course, you don't need to know any of the names on the screen here, but once again, when we're working with governments, we need to be able to present them a vision. And that's kind of what we've been working towards, at least in India, and what we will do in other countries across the continent as well, right? So we've done interesting work aligning towards a sort of national mission or a national plan for this. And this is similar to what our Israel team has done and what we will do, as I mentioned, in Japan, Korea, etc. And then another dimension, of course, of field building is how do we talk about the field? How do we get people excited about the field and get them moving into it? So these are some fantastic examples of what's been happening across Asia. We have our Singapore-based team that's done a fantastic job of getting the space covered. and making it more and more interesting and sexy for people to get into and forge their careers within the space. So, strategic communications is a really key piece of any field building space. We've started to see now a lot more coverage of the effective altruism community in general. And I'm sure you've all been paying attention to the Time magazine cover and the National Geographic and the New Yorker and a lot of different things that have come out recently because of a new book being published. But the opportunity here is for us all to sort of align in the same way that we've aligned in alternative proteins and start thinking about how we communicate strategically about effective altruism and really deliberately think about getting the word out there, aligning who our key audiences are, how we move people into the field, etc. All right, so summarizing a lot of what I just said in terms of principles for how I'm thinking about GFIs and alt proteins growth across Asia, because we have this massive challenge. As I said, over 50% of the world's population. We're going to try and influence all of those people with roughly 100 people, right? And we're at about 30 now across the continent, 35 now across the continent. So we need to hire about, let's say 65, 70, maybe 80 people over the next 3 or 5 years. But we need to be very lean while we direct the field, right? We're working with perhaps slightly less developed external ecosystems in Asia. I'm referring to the column in the middle there. Less developed external ecosystems than exist perhaps in the United States or in Israel. And I can say that really with deep experience of this, because I've been working in India for the last few years. A significant portion of what needs to happen is really bringing everyone together. It's almost like pulling teeth sometimes. And I say that with love. I've enjoyed doing it, but it definitely is like that. It's also obviously very complex, diverse, etc. And that's true even inside one country, but especially across this vast continent. On the left there, as I've said, we need to build a coherent vision. So a lot of what we're trying to do across Asia is actually to make sure that we're sharing best practices across different GFI organizations. Because what we're trying to do in a place like India, while it's not going to be exactly the same as what we want to accomplish in Japan, a significant portion of those lessons are transferable. So we're trying to coordinate significantly across these organizations, especially where we've had one in place for some time, and share those best practices very closely. And then lastly, on the right there, as I mentioned, there's vast differences across this continent. I mean, there's 48 countries, and each of these countries is quite diverse internally as well. But we think of Asia maybe as 3 or 4 different Asia. So there's technology development hubs like Singapore, Japan, Korea. There's supply chain hubs like India, Southeast Asia, agri-supply, biomanufacturing, etc. And then there's consumption hubs like, once again, India, Southeast Asia, etc. And then there's also, of course, China, which is all of the above, right? So we have this opportunity to leverage the complementary or comparative advantages of each of these countries and make the space move forward in that way. So just diving in as an example, if you look at South or Southeast Asia, we have this large crop biodiversity. We have these diverse crops that simply have not been used in the space. If you look at the plant-based egg company Eat Just, they make the Just egg. They make it from the mung bean, which has been produced on the Indian subcontinent for 4,000 years, but no one ever thought to process it into an egg until this one company did this research, right? So we have tremendous opportunity and I guess promise here that's totally untapped. We also have across the continent a globally competitive talent pool. So if you look at, in South and Southeast Asia, a lot of the industries that already exist, there's a huge amount of transferable talent that can come in from pharmaceuticals and biomanufacturing and enzymes and space research and a lot of really exciting spaces. And then lastly, we have governments that are really interested in creating new economic pockets of growth, right? So this is an example of what I mean by leveraging comparative advantage across the continent. We've already been doing some of this stuff. And I think coming back to sort of broader EA field building, there's very many lessons that can be drawn directly from this, right? So aside from what I said earlier, what I've been thinking about as transferable lessons for EA field building is that I think remaining coordinated across the landscape of EA organizations, especially meta or field building organizations globally, is absolutely key. Wherever I have seen EA field builders or even community builders align with each other, the amount of transferable knowledge is really fantastic. It's very productive to bring people together. I've seen this, for instance, with people from EA in the Netherlands or Denmark sharing with people in the Philippines. And really what's possible to build as a result of this collaboration is truly astounding. We have, for instance, even in a specific country, We have different organizations that are engaging the government, that are engaging the media and strategic communications, that are engaging funders. And certainly having some people or some organizations, perhaps even one organization focused on field building that coordinates with these folks is very, very productive. It helps to build a positive narrative of EA. It helps to guard against downside risks. We've certainly seen this as at GFI as the central field building organization. Building a strong narrative for the space is extremely important. Additionally, capacity building, sharing knowledge freely, we've seen the huge benefits from all of this. So we'd love to see, or I'd love to see more of this happening in the EA space. As one example, the flow of capital, philanthropic money, philanthropic donations into specific countries, let's say in India, is highly controlled by the government. It's possible to navigate that, of course, but people who have been through that, like myself, have significant, how do I best put this, maybe PTSD about that experience. And so I think it makes sense to share all of these best practices very freely. I know that whenever I've had these conversations, they've been really illuminating on both sides to have those conversations. So it's really important for us, I think, to have that kind of relationship. And then finally, balancing scale and fidelity, right? So I think we all know this. We want to make sure that whatever happens in newer markets with EA or even in existing hubs, we want to make sure that it is aligned with what we see the future, the most positive future as being. So ensuring that there isn't any misalignment at this stage. Being 1 degree off will bring us to 180 degrees off in a few years. So we'd love to be as aligned as possible. And of course, there's very many other principles that could be drawn from this experience. But the idea is that as long as we're thinking very deliberately about field building, we'll be able to build something that actually is coherent with our values. And I'd like to close out by saying none of what I'm describing is inevitable. I mean, in the alternative protein space or in effective altruism, I think we all realize we could easily fail, right? There's very many reasons why we might. I think that's all the more reason for us to be coordinated, for us to think very deliberately and in service of highest impact when we're building the field. I don't think progress is a natural law. I think it demands all the people that are here, all the people in the community to come together, to focus on working together and to build something of value. So I'm available to think through these problems and to think through field building as an opportunity. It's something that I've been putting a lot of thought towards over the last few years at GFI, and I think that there's been very many additional transferable lessons even beyond what I've said here today. But thank you so much for spending some time with me, and I'd love to take any questions if there are any.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Varun. We do have a number of questions from the swap card interface. So the first one is it worth the EA community trying to accelerate the growth of alternative protein production, or should we just allow market forces to move it forward? What are the neglected areas of alternative protein landscape that an EA should get involved instead of purely profit-motivated agents?
Yeah, this is a great question, Anthony. I don't know who asked the question, but it's a really great question. So we firmly believe, based on what we've seen, that the market will not solve for very many of these problems on its own, right? So we're talking about, for instance, investing in fundamental scientific research that isn't just putting a slight twist on what already exists or putting a slight marketing and positioning twist on a product that already exists. We believe, and the market is telling us, that these products need to get fundamentally better in terms of taste and price and nutrition and availability, etc. So this is a major opportunity, I think. Scientific research and seeing alternative protein scientific research as a career is one major option. Another option is figuring out how the capital can flow to that area and to other areas that might be highest value use, right? So for instance, scientific research is one, but also value chain development, supply chain development, things I mentioned during the presentation. So that can usually flow from places like multilateral finance institutions like the World Bank, like the Asian Development Bank, like all of these groups that actually fund infrastructure and value chain development without the profit motive being the core motive, right? So essentially bringing capital that is socially aligned to the space. This is a specialized area. I mean, if you look into, for instance, green finance, within renewable energy, it's had a huge impact on making that industry viable. Between 2019 2019 and 2022, roughly 30% of all electricity generated was from renewables. That's fantastic progress, but it took 40 years to get there. I don't think we can afford another 40 years within this new space to get to parity with that, right? So we're trying to get there much faster. I think the more talent we can funnel to scientific research, to policy advocacy, to unlock more funding, to green finance, etc., the better it'll be. And that's what we're really advocating for.
Thank you. And the next question from Tilly. So Tilly's wondering if you have any tips for myth busting. So Tilly works in the nutrition field, and lots of people see plant-based meats as processed or artificial, so assume that they're not healthy and are put off by them. I assume they may feel similarly about cultured meat. How can we aim to not put off future customers or investors?
Yeah, this is another great question. I mean, look, once again, I'll say the fundamental improvement here is in fact on product development itself, right? So this is an industry that's still very much in its infancy relative to where it needs to get to. As an example, for plant-based meats, one of the reasons that we have so many ingredients on the label is because from a food science standpoint, the underlying ingredients themselves were not optimized for this industry. They weren't made with this industry in mind. They were made about decades ago with another industry in mind, let's say edible oils or animal feed, etc. So very many companies are using, let's say, a plant protein isolate, a pea protein isolate or a soy protein isolate that is extracted from a soy crop or a pea crop that was in turn made for a different industry. And so what we've optimized for in those crops is not what we need in this industry, right? So where we can invest in scientific development is right across that value chain, from fundamental crop development through to protein extraction and functionalization, through to end product formulation, etc. And this is where I think we can get much better, so that the next generation of products in plant-based meats doesn't have 14 ingredients on the label, it has 9 ingredients on the label, because the ingredient itself has the properties that you need, so you don't need to add in a bunch of additional emulsifiers and other additives, etc. So that's one big intervention. We do also think, I mean, from a nutrition standpoint, these products are inherently better for a number of reasons. No cholesterol, none of the issues associated with cardiovascular disease, and a number of other issues that are associated with animal fat consumption and all of those things. So I think better communication around that, better education around that kind of thing does matter, and we've been looking into some of those things. So there's certainly opportunities to improve that. And then I think more research on what consumers want and how best to communicate to them is also important. So, we're working with very many partners across all of these dimensions, and we'd love to see more come in, because as I said, while I can say that it's all very exciting and there's very many partners in each of these areas, ultimately it's not nearly enough. We're still sort of maybe 2 orders of magnitude below what we need for this to be truly a viable field in the way that renewable energy is a viable field.
I see. Thank you. So another question from Annalie. So she asks, what is the main obstacle to switching to alternative protein for non-vegetarian consumers?
The main obstacle right now is it's a combination of taste and price. Some products get very close, but the median product that's on the market is not nearly there in terms of being fundamentally a simple switch and not a sacrifice on taste, right? Also worth noting that these products are still more expensive, anywhere from 20% to 3x more expensive than their animal-derived counterpart, right? So what we have right now is a promising proof of concept. We know that it can be done because there are some companies that have launched products that are really very good. We know that we can bring down the cost of these products because we've seen interventions like that work in general food and agri and other industries. But we really need to execute the playbook. Right? So we need very many more people entering the space, more capital entering the space, etc., to actually get to a viable replacement.
And a question from Himanshu. What are the top skill talent bottlenecks for GFI?
Ooh, great question. So listen, we hire across all of our departments, business, science, and policy. In our kind of business facing or industry facing side, we look for people that essentially look like consultants, right? So experience in consulting, or working within some of these food companies, biotech companies, manufacturing, etc. is great. On the scientific side, we hire PhD postdoc folks who are global experts in their field. Sorry, I don't know if we're out of time, but I'll wrap up quickly. And on the policy side, we hire folks that really know how to do government affairs, how to deal with external stakeholders that are quite high level, right? So I think across the board, what we are also looking for is great communicators, people who are elite at stakeholder management, communication, etc. Because we run very lean teams relative to the goals that we're trying to achieve. And that's kind of what a field building organization is. We will always have to be very lean. So ideally, even if you're a global expert in cell cultivation, you should be also a great science communicator. And that's a very high bar, but that's the kind of the folks that we're trying to hire.
I see. We still have a couple of minutes left. So there's another question from Zainab. Are there something like geographical assessment data for potential countries in the Middle East and North African region for cultivated meat technology?
Yeah, so we have been thinking about some of these questions because when you're thinking about advancing, let's say, a subcategory, a single category like cultivated meat, it's bringing biotechnology experience and expertise. So some of the biotechnology has existed within, let's say, the pharma industry for decades, right? Because you're taking a cell culture process. And anyone who's been in biology, the biological sciences, you've maybe done like cell culture research. I did it. I wasn't very good at it, but I did it when I was in university. And then you're applying a food lens on it and scaling it up, right? So we're trying to produce vast quantities of meat using cells of animals. So it's several orders of magnitude larger than what exists in, let's say, monoclonal antibodies or other biopharma industry spaces, right? So when you look at fundamental technology development, maybe you need a lot of vested comparative advantage, like decades of biopharma experience and infrastructure and talent in that market to be able to advance the space fundamentally from a research standpoint. So I think countries like Japan are probably best placed to do that. Japan, the US, Europe, etc. However, it is entirely possible to advance cost innovation and manufacturing. And then that's where countries like India and Southeast Asia come into play. As an example, India manufactures 60% of the world's vaccines, right? So there's an opportunity there to take a lot of that knowledge and talent and bring it into this space translationally. Now, when it comes to places like the Middle East, we think there's an opportunity primarily because there's a lot of capital that can flow into this space and that's looking for opportunities to deploy in sustainable development, right? Which can secure food security locally as well as become a manufacturing hub for the rest of the world. There's also fundamental scientific questions or manufacturing questions that need to be figured out, right? So if this is a delicate manufacturing process, how do we localize it for the unique agroclimatic conditions of the Middle East? Obviously, the climate is different from what it is in Japan, as an example. So I think there is opportunity. We haven't done very deep dives into like how we might do work in the Middle East. Unfortunately, because we're quite stretched, we haven't had an opportunity to establish, for example, a GFI GCC or a GFI UAE. We've done some work there, but we'd be happy to answer any questions or share across any resources that we have if you email us. So, Anthony, do you mind if I just share my email right now?
Yeah, sure. Go on.
Yeah, so my email is Varun D, that's first name D, that's the first letter of my last name, at gfi.org, as in goodfoodinstitute.org. Varun D at gfi.org. If you email me, I'll try to get you as much information as we have on the Middle East.
That's fantastic. We've got 1 or 2 minutes left, so I have a personal question for you, Varun. You mentioned you almost get PTSD from dealing with institutional or governmental level when you're doing advocacy work with them. Do you have something that you can quickly share with us about your experience?
Yeah, and to be clear, I said institutional governmental level stuff when it comes to the admin and the ops and making sure that the lights are on, right? Like that you're in compliance with everything and you're not like in contravention with philanthropic capital flows and reporting and all of that stuff. As far as the actual policy work, like the programmatic work is concerned, I love that. I live for that, right? And so the idea that we have a complex patchwork of government agencies is not uniquely true to India. It's true in the US, it's true in Japan, and I love that, right? Weaving everything together, trying to get to the stage where we have a national plan. That is, I mean, it just sets me on fire. I love that stuff. As an example of what we can achieve, and I will get to answering your question, Anthony, but an example of what we can achieve, in Israel, about 3 weeks ago, they announced their top 5 R&D priorities for the next decade. And obviously, national defense was number one, which is it's sort of taken as given. Number two was food technology and alternative proteins was the number 2 thing that they've set as an R&D priority by 2030. That is incredible. I mean, like that's a testament to what we can achieve if we traverse these complicated government pathways, right? And of course, Israel is very different from other countries, but you get the point. As far as your actual question was concerned, let me put it this way. I think in the effective altruism community, we have very many talented folks who maybe have not dealt with these issues before. And some of these issues are setting up the right legal entity, making sure capital flows in the right way, raising money locally versus abroad, getting all the right certifications in place. This creates huge debt in terms of time and just emotional turmoil and all of the things that you need to deal with. So I think we all know that we need great operations people in EA. It's been something that 80,000 Hours has been speaking about for a very long time. But the degree to which we can all share with each other best practices, I think that would be really transformative. And I think the extent to which we can make that happen in a deliberate way, I would love to support that.
I see. We have one important last question for you, Varun. So what action points would you recommend for people interested in exploring alternative protein? Any resources, fellowships, for example, that you would recommend us to look at?
Yeah, so I think if you go to our website, gfi.org, that's the kind of global US website. We have a huge library of resources when it comes to science, industry, and policy. We also have an online course. So it's like a MOOC style online course that you can take to explore the space. We have student guides. So one great way of getting involved, especially if you are younger or you are a student, including all the way up to the postdoc level, is to join or to start one of those student groups I was mentioning, all protein project groups. I think that's a great sort of transformative way to get involved. And then, please reach out to us as well. We have very many newsletters, opportunities to reach out, join different communities that are oriented towards science or business and otherwise. I think if you take a look at our website, you'll see a lot of it. But feel free to email me at varund@gfi.org, and I'll make sure that you get in touch with the right people as well.
All right. Thank you very much, Varun, for your time. And we'll conclude our session here. Thank you very much for watching, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Anthony.